Hey guys! Tonight we're going to wander off into the desert. Don't worry, I've packed the imaginary water skins and a few camels because tonight's story is all about the Silk Road. Yeah, that one. The glamorous trade route that stretched all the way from China to the Mediterranean. The one you probably half remember from high school history class, where your teacher droned on about caravans and spices while you stared at the clock. But here, we're going to slow it down. Way down. Think less National Geographic Adventure Special and more, let's tuck you in and ramble about camels for the next 90 minutes. So, dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and get ready to listen to what is essentially the world's most exhausting road trip. Because the Silk Road wasn't one road. It was a whole mess of them. Thousands of miles of dusty paths, rocky passes, marshy detours, and the occasional bandit-infested shortcut. And yet, for centuries, this was the lifeline of global trade. Well, as global as things got before Columbus decided to bump into the wrong continent. Now, the Silk Road gets its name from, you guessed it, silk. That shiny, luxurious fabric that everyone in Europe went absolutely feral for. Because nothing said, I'm better than you in the year 200 CE, like wrapping yourself in a material made from bug spit. And yes, silk is literally bug spit. But try telling that to some Roman senator who just paid half his fortune for a toga that looked fabulous but itched like crazy in the Mediterranean heat. But before we get too distracted by itchy senators, let's start where it all began, ancient China. Because without the Chinese figuring out how to domesticate silkworms and keep it a secret, the Silk Road wouldn't have existed. So picture this, somewhere around 2700 BCE, so basically forever ago, a Chinese empress named Lezu, or maybe just someone with that name in the legends, supposedly sat under a mulberry tree. She dropped her teacup and, because fate has a sense of drama, a cocoon plopped into her hot tea. Instead of fishing it out like a normal person, she apparently just started tugging at the threads. And surprise, surprise, silk was born. Was it really that cinematic? Probably not. More likely, some very bored and slightly desperate people just experimented with boiling bugs until they got fabric, because humans will literally mess with anything if it might turn into a blanket. But, legend or not, silk became China's best-kept secret. Exporting it was fine, but teaching foreigners how to make it? Absolutely illegal. People were executed if they tried to smuggle silkworms out. Which, if you think about it, is peak commitment to protecting intellectual property. Forget patents, just execute anyone who tries to copy you. Microsoft could never. Anyway, by the time we're in the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, silk wasn't just fabric, it was currency. Soldiers could be paid in rolls of it, bureaucrats collected it as tax, and nobles wore it to remind everyone else that they were, in fact, the sparkle elite. Which brings us to Emperor Wu of Han. He's the one who decided, hey, maybe we should expand our little trading bubble. Now, Emperor Wu wasn't exactly a chill dude. He had big empire on my mind energy. He wanted allies against those pesky nomadic tribes, the Xiongnu, who kept raiding Chinese borders. So he sent out this poor guy, Zhang Qian, as an envoy. Zhang Qian's mission was basically, go west, find friends, don't die. Naturally, he got captured almost immediately. Spent like 10 years in captivity, got married, had kids, and then one day just casually escaped and kept going. Which is kind of impressive, really. When Zhang Qian finally made it back to China, 20 years later, he hadn't exactly formed the alliances Emperor Wu wanted, but he had gathered a ton of intel. He'd seen horses in Central Asia that made Chinese horses look like sad little donkeys. He'd spotted grapes, new foods, new ideas. And Emperor Wu thought, okay, maybe we can work with this. So trade slowly opened up, and thus the Silk Road, in all its dusty, camel-heavy glory, began to take shape. Now, I know what you're thinking. But wasn't it dangerous? Oh, absolutely. The Silk Road was basically a never-ending gauntlet of things trying to kill you. If it wasn't the weather, burning deserts, freezing mountains, it was bandits. If it wasn't bandits, it was disease. And if you somehow made it through all that, you got to haggle with merchants who were professional-level scammers. Imagine spending months hauling your goods across the Gobi Desert only to have some guy in Samarkand tell you your precious silk is kind of last season. And speaking of Samarkand, let's pause on that. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, these were the cities that grew fat on trade. They were the Middle Eve equivalent of airport hubs. You'd stop, unload, maybe switch caravans, definitely overpay for food, and then keep going. The locals made fortunes being the middlemen because, let's face it, no single trader actually traveled the entire Silk Road. That would have been insane. Instead, goods hopped along like awkward, dusty hot potatoes. Chinese silk might pass through 20 different hands before some Roman noble got his toga. And each hand, of course, took a cut. And oh, the Romans! The Romans were obsessed with silk. They couldn't get enough. By the 1st century CE, silk was flooding into Rome. Senators wore it to show off, their wives wore it to show off, even emperors wore it. Though technically, Roman law banned men from wearing pure silk because it was considered too decadent, which naturally meant everyone immediately wore pure silk anyway. Laws are suggestions when you're rich. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some Roman moralists were horrified. They thought silk was corrupting Roman values. One senator even complained that silk made women naked in public, which, to be fair, probably just meant it was a little sheer. But leave it to Roman men to panic about fabric transparency. Meanwhile, the treasury was draining because Rome had to pay in gold and silver for this stuff, since they didn't exactly have much to trade back that China wanted. The Romans basically became silk addicts. Importing so much, China was practically Scrooge McDuck swimming in Roman coins. But the Silk Road wasn't just about silk. Oh no, spices traveled west, horses traveled east, glassware, precious stones, ivory, ID.
All right, so we've set the stage with China, bug-spit fabric, and Romans crying about see-through togas. But in between those two ends of the Silk Road was a whole buffet of civilizations who did what any smart person does when they see someone rich and desperate. They inserted themselves in the middle and took a cut. Because, let's be honest, the Silk Road wasn't really about brave merchants trekking all the way from Xi'an to Rome. That sounds romantic, like a Hollywood adventure movie with sweeping desert shots and a dramatic soundtrack. In reality, it was much lazier. A Chinese trader would sell his silk in Dunhuang. That guy would sell it to another in Kashgar. That guy would sell it to some Persian in Merv. And on until it reached some Italian merchant in Antioch who doubled the price, slapped a Made in the East tag on it, and sold it to a Roman senator who didn't ask questions. So really, the Silk Road was less one epic journey and more a long chain of people shrugging and saying, "Not my problem, pay me." And nowhere was this chain more obvious than Central Asia. If China and Rome were the impatient rich kids at opposite ends of the playground, Central Asia was the guy in the middle with the lemonade stand charging $5 a cup. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar thrived because they were perfectly placed between deserts and mountains. Caravans had to stop there, no matter how much they wanted to just keep walking, which meant they had to pay fees, taxes, and definitely overpay for stale bread and goat stew. Now, the Persians were absolute pros at this. Long before the Silk Road was officially a thing, the Persian Empire under Darius the Great had already built roads for their own use. They had the Royal Road, which stretched about 1,500 miles and had rest stations every 15 miles or so. Basically, the ancient world's version of a highway with service stations. Except instead of McDonald's, you got slightly less stale bread and probably a goat glaring at you. By the time the Silk Road was in full swing, the Persian territories were in the perfect position to collect tolls. Imagine being a Roman merchant trying to get your shiny silk back home. You'd finally drag your caravan out of the desert only to find some Persian tax collector waiting with a smile that said, "Pay up." because nothing screams economic genius like putting your empire directly in the way of other people's shopping sprees. And they didn't just tax goods, they controlled caravanserais, those little roadside inns where travelers could collapse for a night. These weren't exactly the Ritz. Think more like a walled courtyard, a few straw mats, some suspicious stew, and a lot of snoring camels. But when you've been trudging through sandstorms for a week, even a smelly mat probably felt like heaven. And of course, you had to pay for it. So the Persians and later the various Islamic caliphates made bank. And now let's float up a bit north to the Sogdians. If you've never heard of them, don't worry. They're one of those groups that history quietly swept under the rug, even though they were basically the Silk Road's MVPs. The Sogdians lived in Central Asia, mostly around Samarkand and Bukhara, and their entire cultural personality was middleman. They were polyglot merchants who spoke a dozen languages, wrote contracts, and basically made the Silk Road function. Without them, the whole system would have collapsed. Think of the Sogdians as the sketchy but reliable shipping company of the ancient world. You gave them your goods, and somehow, through a maze of bandits, deserts, and political drama, your silk or spices actually arrived at its destination. Sure, maybe a third of it disappeared along the way, but hey, that's the cost of business. The Sogdians were so good at this that even when empires rose and fell around them, they just kept trading. China respected them, Persia respected them, and later the Islamic caliphates respected them. Nobody really liked them because, let's face it, no one loves middlemen, but everyone needed them, which is basically the story of middle management for all of history. And while we're floating westward now, let's not forget the Parthians. Oh yes, the Parthians. You know, the empire everyone sort of skips in history class between Greeks and Romans. They were masters of horse archery, the famous Parthian shot, where they'd pretend to flee and then shoot you in the face while riding away. Not exactly neighbor of the year material. But more important for our sleepy story, they sat directly between Rome and China. And what did they do with this geographical jackpot? They blocked direct trade. That's right, when Roman envoys tried to march east to get their hands on silk at the source, the Parthians said, "Nope, you can only trade with us," which was basically them saying, "We're the exclusive middlemen now, deal with it." The Romans hated this. They complained about Parthian greed. They whined about the costs. But at the end of the day, they still bought the silk, because addiction doesn't care about your wallet. So if you're picturing all these caravans gliding along peacefully, let me gently ruin that, because the Silk Road was also a breeding ground for conflict. Every time a new empire rose in Central Asia, the taxes changed. Bandits were encouraged or crushed, depending on the ruler's mood. Some cities became rich, others were burned to the ground. Entire empires basically made their living taxing Silk Road trade and then collapsed as soon as someone else cut them off. Take the Kushan Empire, for example. They popped up in what's now Afghanistan and northern India, right along the Silk Road routes, and they milked it for all it was worth. They were middlemen for silk, spices, gems, and, fun fact, Buddhism, because the Kushans were huge in spreading Buddhism from India into Central Asia and eventually China. You might thank them for your local meditation app if they hadn't disappeared in the 4th century. But while they lasted, they thrived off caravans dragging themselves through mountain passes and happily paying Kushan tariffs. And speaking of mountain passes, let's talk about those for a second, because if there's one thing that made the Silk Road a nightmare, it was geography. You had deserts like the Taklamakan, which literally translates to, "Go in and you won't come out." Very reassuring. You had the Pamir Mountains, which might as well have been labeled, "Congratulations, you've chosen frostbite." And then you had endless steppes, which were basically flat nothingness with bonus nomadic raiders. Every possible natural obstacle was included in the Silk Road package. This is why stopping points like Kashgar were so important. Kashgar sat at the crossroads where routes split north and south of the Taklamakan Desert, and it became this bustling hub of weary travelers, dusty goods, and endless haggling. Imagine the smell of 1,000 camels crammed together, merchants arguing in 10 languages, and some poor innkeeper yelling because someone's goat got loose again. That was the Silk Road vibe. And yet, despite the dust, the danger, and the constant sense that you were probably being ripped off, the Silk Road flourished. Not because people enjoyed it, nobody enjoyed it, but because the profits were just too good. You buy silk in China for one price, drag it west and sell it in Rome for 10 times the amount. That kind of markup made all the camel blisters worth it. So as we drift along this imaginary caravan, remember, the Silk Road wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble. It was dusty, dangerous, and deeply annoying. But it worked. It connected empires that never met face to face. It spread religions, ideas, and diseases with equal efficiency. And in the middle, you had the Persians, Sogdians, Parthians, Kushans, and countless others, all cashing in on being the world's most irritating yet indispensable middlemen. Let's shuffle westward a little more now, past the deserts, past the mountain passes, into the Byzantine Empire, and later the Islamic Golden Age, where silk didn't just move, it transformed.
So we've trudged through Central Asia, dodged Parthian toll booths, and endured the smell of Kashgar's 1,000 camels. Now our imaginary caravan lumbers westward into the lands of the Byzantines. And if you thought the Romans were dramatic about silk, well, the Byzantines said, "Hold my goblet of watered-down wine." Because silk in Byzantium wasn't just fabric, it was politics, power, and propaganda all rolled up into shiny robes. The Byzantines took one look at how much the Roman elite had loved silk and decided to crank it up to 11. By the 6th century CE, silk had become a full-blown imperial obsession. Emperors wore it to look holy and untouchable. Bishops wore it because, apparently, God appreciated good fashion. Even the court eunuchs wore it, and you know things are serious when eunuchs get a glow-up. Ordinary people? Forget it. Pure silk was banned for the masses. Not that this stopped anyone. Smugglers thrived because if humans love anything more than luxury, it's sneaking luxury past customs. Now, the problem was, Byzantium didn't actually make silk. They had to buy it, which meant they were at the mercy of those awkward middlemen. Persians, Sogdians, and basically anyone between Constantinople and China. And the Persians, bless them, charged outrageous prices, which drove the Byzantines absolutely nuts. And then came Emperor Justinian I. You might remember him as the guy who built the Hagia Sophia, tried to reconquer half of the old Roman Empire, and accidentally oversaw one of the deadliest plagues in history. Busy man. But on his long to-do list, there was also this: stop overpaying for bug spit cloth. Enter one of the most bizarre episodes of Silk Road history, the silkworm heist. So the story goes, sometime in the 6th century, a pair of monks who had been hanging out in China, probably pretending to spread Christianity while secretly taking notes on everything, came back to Justinian with a juicy secret. They had learned how silk was made. And no, not just boil the cocoons, but the whole deal. The mulberry trees, the silkworms, the entire production line. Of course, you couldn't exactly carry a bunch of squirmy worms across the Silk Road without raising suspicions, so in true monk Mission Impossible fashion, they smuggled silkworm eggs inside hollowed-out bamboo canes, just casually strolling back west with their holy staffs full of bug babies, because that's not suspicious at all. When they handed these contraband canes over to Justinian, it changed everything. Suddenly, Byzantium didn't need to buy silk. They could make it. And oh, did they. The imperial government immediately set up silk workshops. Not private businesses, mind you, but state-controlled factories. Because if there's one thing Justinian loved, it was micromanaging an empire. From then on, Byzantium silk became the luxury item of Europe and the Mediterranean. They controlled production, they controlled sales, and they made sure everyone knew that the emperor literally held the keys to shiny fashion. Want to bribe a foreign ruler? Send them a Byzantine silk robe. Want to flex on your enemies? Show up to negotiations wrapped in silk like a divine burrito. The Byzantines weaponized fabric. Meanwhile, further south,
the Islamic caliphates were also getting in on the action. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Islam had spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain, which meant new rulers sitting right across those key Silk Road routes. And unlike some empires that just taxed caravans, the Islamic world went full entrepreneur mode. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became dazzling trade hubs. They didn't just import silk, they started weaving their own. They blended designs from China, Persia, and Byzantium, creating these insanely detailed fabrics with gold thread, geometric patterns, and calligraphy woven in. Silk wasn't just clothing, it was art. And if you think Islamic architecture is pretty, their fabrics were basically the same aesthetic, just wearable. Baghdad especially became a superstar. Founded in the 8th century by the Abbasid caliphs, it was deliberately placed to control east-west trade. Imagine endless markets filled with silk, spices, books, perfumes, and suspiciously large bags of dates. Scholars hung out in libraries, translating Greek texts into Arabic. Merchants haggled loudly in every dialect under the sun. Poets complained about camel smells. Baghdad was basically New York City of the 9th century, minus the subway rats. And here's the thing. While Europe was still fumbling around in what people like to call the Dark Ages, the Islamic world was glowing. Silk from the East passed through Muslim lands, got remixed into stunning new designs, and then trickled westward into Europe, where nobles drooled over it and peasants probably didn't even know it existed. Of course, this also meant the Islamic empires became filthy rich middlemen. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, later the Fatimids, they all took their cut. And unlike the Persians who just taxed stuff, the Muslims built entire industries around silk. So when you picture some medieval European knight in fancy embroidered robes, chances are that cloth was made in Cairo or Baghdad, not Constantinople or China. Now, all of this, Byzantines fording silkworms, Arabs running massive trade networks, Persians toll boothing like champions, made the Silk Road less of a road and more of a political tug-of-war. Who controlled the trade routes? Who got to tax the caravans? Who monopolized production? It was like Monopoly, but with camels and more dust. And much like Monopoly, it usually ended in bankruptcy and family feuds. And through all of this, the actual travelers, the merchants and caravan hands, were probably just tired. Imagine trudging along for weeks, dodging bandits, dealing with bribes at every city gate, listening to the endless chewing noises of camels, only to arrive in Baghdad and have some scribe haggle you down so aggressively you wonder if the silk was even worth it. But for the cities, for the empires, for the elites lounging in their shimmering robes, it was worth it. Silk wasn't just cloth, it was power, it was wealth, it was the visual proof that you were connected to the great arteries of global trade. The Byzantines flexed it, the Abbasids refined it, and somewhere in the background, monks were still patting themselves on the back for their successful bug smuggling mission. So, as we drift westward now, silk firmly woven into the fabric of Europe and the Middle East, the question becomes, what happens when the Europeans finally stop just drooling over silk and actually start joining the game themselves? Spoiler, they're going to make it awkward.
So, while the Byzantines and Abbasids were out here living their best silk-swathed lives, Western Europe was, well, let's say behind the trend. Imagine the cool kids at school all wearing designer silk jackets, while Western Europe was still trying to figure out how to wash their wool without shrinking it. That's basically the situation until about the 11th century. For centuries, Europe got its silk secondhand. Byzantine silk trickled west, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through smugglers, and sometimes through sheer theft. The Islamic empires sold their versions at a markup, and European nobles paid through the nose because nothing screams, "I'm better than you," at a medieval feast like showing up in a shiny imported robe while everyone else looks like a potato sack. But then came the Crusades. Ah yes, the Crusades. A centuries-long series of awkward military tourism projects where European knights charged into the Holy Land, promptly melted in the heat, and realized they were wildly out of their depth. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the crusade details, mostly because there were a lot of them, and honestly, even medieval chroniclers lost track. But the important part here is this: the Crusaders came face to face with the wealth of the Islamic world. They saw silk everywhere. Silken tents, silken robes, silken banners fluttering dramatically in the desert wind while they stood there in sweaty chainmail, wondering why their god hated them. And when the Crusaders eventually stumbled back home, minus a few limbs, plus a few diseases, they carried stories of riches, of spices, perfumes, sugar, and most importantly, silk. Suddenly, Western Europe had a taste for luxury it couldn't afford and definitely couldn't produce, which naturally meant they became dependent on the middlemen once again. Enter the Italians, because if there's one thing Italy has always been good at, it's business. Cities like Venice and Genoa saw an opportunity. They had the ships, they had the trade networks, and they had absolutely no shame about charging extortionate prices, so they dove headfirst into Silk Road commerce. Venice especially became the superstar. By the 13th century, Venetian merchants were practically running the import-export scene for luxury goods into Europe. They bought silk in Constantinople or Alexandria, hauled it back on their ships, and sold it at obscene markups in European markets. Venetian merchants became so rich and annoying that everyone else in Europe both envied them and plotted their downfall. Standard Italian behavior, really. And of course, this is where we meet our favorite travel influencer of the Middle Ages, Marco Polo. Now, Marco Polo's story is one of those things people either love or roll their eyes at. Born in Venice in 1254, he was the son of a merchant family that already dabbled in Eastern trade. At 17, Marco tagged along with his dad and uncle on what was basically the longest business trip ever. They didn't just go to Constantinople or Antioch. Oh no, they marched straight across Asia to the court of Kublai Khan in China. Supposedly, Marco Polo spent about 20 years in Mongol territory, serving as some kind of envoy for the Khan, picking up languages, gawking at riches, and taking endless mental notes. When he finally returned to Venice in the 1290s, he had the kind of stories that made people lean in at dinner parties and whisper, "Did he just make half of that up?" Because here's the thing, Marco Polo's travels became Europe's ultimate Silk Road guidebook. But historians are still split on how much of it he actually saw. Did he really work for Kublai Khan? Did he really visit all those places? Or did he just embellish the stories he'd heard from Persian merchants along the way? Honestly, nobody's sure, but his book was so detailed, describing paper money, coal, porcelain, silk production, that it blew European minds. Imagine being a medieval peasant who thought Paris was the height of civilization, then hearing about cities in China with millions of people, giant canals and markets overflowing with luxury. Marco Polo's stories made Europe realize just how small and shabby it was compared to the East, which, of course, fueled even more obsession with silk, spices, and everything else they couldn't get enough of. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Venice and Genoa weren't just importing silk, they started producing it. By the late Middle Ages, Italian cities had stolen enough knowledge, smuggled enough silkworms, and hired enough weavers from the East to set up their own silk industries. Places like Lucca, Florence, and Venice became centers of European silk weaving. Sure, their fabrics weren't as good as Chinese silk at first, but they improved fast, because nothing motivates innovation than not wanting to pay middlemen prices anymore. Of course, all of this came with drama. Venetian merchants got into constant fights with Genoese merchants. The Byzantines alternately traded with and fought against the Italians. The Islamic empires kept shifting who controlled the ports. And through it all, caravans still trudged across Central Asia because demand for silk wasn't slowing down anytime soon. But here's where things start to turn. By the 14th century, the Silk Road wasn't just carrying silk, it was also carrying death. Yep, cue the Black Death, hitching a ride on fleas, rats, and trade caravans from Asia to Europe. By 1347, plague ships were docking in Italian ports, and within a few years, Europe had lost somewhere between a third and one-half of its population. It's a bit grim for bedtime history, I know, but it does highlight just how connected the world had become thanks to the Silk Road. Goods, ideas, religions, diseases,
All of it moved along those dusty paths. You couldn't separate the silk from the side effects. And yet, even with plague wiping out millions, the demand for silk didn't die. If anything, surviving elites doubled down on showing off wealth, because nothing says I lived through a pandemic like draping yourself in gold-threaded silk while your peasants are still coughing in the background. So by the end of the Middle Ages, Western Europe had fully joined the silk craze. Italy was weaving it, nobles were hoarding it, and Venetian merchants were practically printing money off it. The Silk Road was still grinding along, but something new was about to shake things up: the age of maritime trade. Because as much as caravans and camels had done the job for centuries, Europeans were starting to think, what if we just sailed directly to Asia instead of paying a dozen middlemen? And that little thought would eventually launch an era of exploration, colonization, and all sorts of awkward encounters on the high seas. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, picture Venice at its peak: glittering palaces, ships groaning with silk, merchants squabbling in the piazza, and somewhere out there, Marco Polo probably still insisting, no seriously, I did meet Kublai Khan.
So far, the Silk Road has been all about land. Deserts, mountain passes, tired camels, and middlemen charging too much for water and bread. But by the 15th century, Europe had started asking the obvious question: why are we still walking? We have boats. And honestly, fair point. For over 1,000 years, Europeans had grumbled about how expensive silk and spices were. They moaned about Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, Venetians, Ottomans, basically anyone standing between them and Asia. And finally, someone in Portugal looked at a map and thought, what if we just sail around Africa and cut out the middle guys? Enter Prince Henry the Navigator, which is a funny nickname because he didn't actually do much navigating. He mostly sat in Portugal while hiring other people to risk their lives on the ocean. But branding is everything, and Henry got the credit. His push for maritime exploration set Portugal on the path to rounding Africa, eventually reaching India in 1498 with Vasco da Gama. Now, Vasco's trip was not exactly glamorous. Half his crew died of scurvy, they got lost a lot, and when they finally showed up in Calicut, India, they were basically laughed at for bringing worthless trade goods. But still, they had proven the concept. Europe could sail directly to Asia. No more camels, no more tolls in Samarkand, just ships, storms, and the occasional pirate. Meanwhile, Spain said, well, if Portugal can do it, we can too. But instead of going around Africa, they banked on this random Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who swore the world was smaller than it actually was. Spoiler, he was wrong. Instead of reaching Asia, he ran into the Americas, which was awkward, but hey, he found gold and people to exploit, so Spain decided it was still a win. For the Silk Road, this was the beginning of the end. Because once Europeans realized they could access Asia by sea, the land routes slowly started losing relevance. Why trudge through deserts and bribe 50 tax collectors when you could just load up a ship, hope you didn't sink, and reach India with cargo holds full of pepper? And speaking of pepper, let's pause here, because silk wasn't actually the main prize anymore. By the 15th century, Europeans were even more obsessed with spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, stuff that today you might just sprinkle on toast or pumpkin pie, was once worth literal gold. People went bankrupt trying to buy nutmeg. Wars were fought over cloves. If you think that sounds insane, just remember, medieval European food was so bland and rotten that people would pay anything to mask the taste. But silk was still in the mix. Chinese and Indian silk remained in high demand, and as maritime trade routes expanded, silk joined spices, porcelain, and tea on ships heading west. The old Silk Road wasn't gone overnight. Caravans still trudged along for centuries, but its golden age was over. Now, while Portugal and Spain were busy carving out sea empires, Venice had a meltdown. For centuries, Venetian merchants had milked the Silk Road system, but suddenly all these Portuguese and Spanish ships were bypassing them. Venice went from being the cool kid with all the exotic goods to the sad older sibling watching new kids take over the playground.
They tried to adapt, but the sea trade was just too efficient. And then came the Ottomans. Oh yes, the Ottomans. By the 15th century, they had gobbled up Constantinople, in 1453 for those keeping score, and turned it into Istanbul. They controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the old Byzantine lands, and most of the key routes from Asia, which meant they basically strangled what was left of overland trade and funneled it through their empire. Naturally, they charged ridiculous tolls, which only made Europeans more desperate to find alternative routes. So in a way, you can thank the Ottomans for accidentally sparking the age of exploration. By being so good at taxing caravans, they pushed Europe to say, fine, we'll just build better boats. And those boats eventually circled the entire globe. Now, let's drift back east for a second, because the Mongols deserve a mention here too. Remember them? Back in the 13th century, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan had actually revived the Silk Road in a big way. For about a century, there was this thing historians love to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which is hilarious because the Mongols weren't exactly peaceful. But once they'd finished conquering and burning everything, they did create a massive unified empire that made Silk Road trade safer than it had been in centuries. Merchants could actually travel long distances without constant bandit attacks. Caravans moved freely. Marco Polo thrived in this environment. But when the Mongol Empire fragmented, so did that stability. Suddenly, the road was back to being a patchwork of risky territories, and that instability only made the sea routes more attractive later on. So by the 16th century, the Silk Road was fading. The caravans were still out there, plodding along, but the big money was flowing by ship. The Portuguese dominated for a while, then the Spanish, then the Dutch and the British showed up like the overachieving kids at a science fair, building massive global trade empires. And silk? It remained iconic. By the 17th century, Europeans weren't just importing it, they were imitating it. France and England both built up their own silk weaving industries. Lyon in France became famous for silk, especially under Louis XIV, who basically wallpapered Versailles in it. England's Spitalfields district in London got filled with Huguenot weavers producing fancy fabrics. Silk was no longer just an exotic import, it had gone global. But at the root of it all, those little silkworms on their mulberry leaves in China were still the source. No matter how far silk traveled, no matter how many empires taxed it, no matter how many Europeans tried to copy it, the thread always went back to those worms spinning their cocoons. Which is oddly poetic if you think about it. Humanity built wars, cities, and empires around bug spit. And as the maritime world boomed, the Silk Road slowly slipped into legend. By the 18th century, it was less an active trade network and more a romantic memory of camel caravans trudging through golden sands, which honestly is exactly the kind of thing historians love to get misty-eyed about. So, the Silk Road story isn't one of a clean rise and fall. It's more of a long, dusty shuffle that eventually got outpaced by boats. For over 1,000 years, it connected east and west, carried silk and spices, spread religions and diseases, and shaped empires. And then, when the ocean highways opened, it quietly faded into the background, leaving behind ruins of caravanserais, legends of Marco Polo, and a trail of overpriced silk robes in European wardrobes. But before we let the camels rest for good, let's take one more slow wander. Because the Silk Road might have ended as an economic powerhouse, but as a cultural highway, its legacy lingers on.
So picture this. It's the 18th century. Europe is fully obsessed with its ships, colonizing everything it can reach and drawing questionable maps of the world. The Silk Road, once the glamorous backbone of global trade, has become, let's just say, the backroads of history. Caravans are still out there, yes, plodding through dust storms and mountain passes, but the big business has moved to the sea. The Silk Road is no longer the star of the show. But here's the thing. You can't just erase 1,000+ years of cultural mingling. Even when the caravans slowed down, the road had already left behind an incredible cultural imprint. Religions, languages, art, and food all permanently scrambled across continents because some trader once decided to swap a horse for a roll of silk. Take religion, for example. The Silk Road was basically the original spiritual highway. Buddhism spread from India into China, Korea, and Japan, thanks to monks traveling along those dusty caravan trails. Islam rode the road west into Central Asia and east into China. Nestorian Christianity, yes, that tiny branch of Christianity most people forget existed, managed to hitch a ride all the way into China, too. Zoroastrian fire temples popped up in odd places, just as Islamic calligraphy appeared in silk patterns. All because people were moving and talking while waiting for their camels to stop spitting. And let's not forget disease. We've mentioned it, but it deserves one last sleepy nod. The Black Death didn't just happen out of nowhere. It piggybacked along the Silk Road, moving with rats, fleas, and humans from Asia into Europe. Which means that in a dark, ironic way, the Silk Road shaped not just cultures, but population numbers. Medieval Europe's entire trajectory shifted because of trade routes, carrying death. Thanks, fleas! But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Art also had a field day. Chinese motifs blended in with Persian miniatures. Islamic geometric patterns found their way onto European fabrics. The world's decorative vocabulary basically became one giant remix tape curated by merchants who probably didn't even realize they were making art history. A piece of pottery in Samarkand might have Persian shapes, Chinese glazes, and an Arabic inscription. That's what happens when you make a global highway. Everything gets mashed together. Even languages got scrambled. Along the Silk Road, you had entire towns speaking multiple tongues just to get by. Merchants needed to haggle in Persian, bargain in Turkic, chat in Arabic, scribble in Chinese. The result was a messy but fascinating linguistic soup. It wasn't exactly Esperanto, but it was the closest medieval traders ever got. Now, fast forward again. By the 19th century, the Silk Road had become less of a functioning trade route and more of a historical curiosity. European explorers loved to retrace parts of it, writing long and usually self-important travel logs about crossing deserts and rediscovering ancient cities that locals had been living in the whole time. You know, classic explorer energy. This is also when archaeologists got involved, digging up old caravansaries, temples, manuscripts, and artifacts left behind along the road. Suddenly, the Silk Road became a story about lost civilizations, ruined cities swallowed by sand, and forgotten manuscripts rescued from caves. In other words, it became romantic. People loved to imagine it as this golden thread tying the world together in mystery and adventure. Which is funny because for most people actually living on the Silk Road, it wasn't romantic at all. It was hot, dusty, dangerous, and occasionally deadly. Merchants weren't writing poetry about the shimmering sands, they were swatting flies and wondering how many tolls they'd have to pay before the next city. But hey, history has a way of polishing things up for the storytelling market. And let's not forget the food legacy. Because yes, spaghetti. Sorry, Italy, but your national dish owes a quiet debt to Chinese noodles traveling along the Silk Road. The tomato part came later from the Americas, but the idea of long, stretchy wheat noodles definitely had an Eastern origin. Even dumplings, a staple from China to Poland, spread along this culinary highway. You've got momo in Tibet, mantu in Central Asia, pierogi in Eastern Europe, all cousins, all descended from dough wrapped around filling, carried along by traders too tired to invent something new. Tea is another legacy. Tea culture in China was ancient, but it spread west along the Silk Road, eventually becoming a global obsession. Russia, for example, became a massive tea importer via overland caravans. To this day, samovars and endless cups of tea are a Russian tradition with roots in Silk Road trade. And even in modern times, the Silk Road refuses to fully die. In the 20th century, as railroads and highways expanded, people kept using the phrase Silk Road as a nostalgic label. And now, in the 21st century, China has literally branded its big infrastructure project the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a massive attempt to recreate the old trade connections with new roads, railways, and shipping lines. Proof that the romance of the Silk Road
Hey guys,
is too good to let go.
tonight we're going to drift back about 1,500 years into a time that everyone likes to call the Dark Ages. You know, that mysterious era wedged between the glory days of Rome and the dramatic Renaissance with all its fancy paintings and men in tights. Now, people love to imagine the Dark Ages as this endless nightmare where peasants rolled around in mud, kings wore rusty crowns, and everyone just died of plague or got stabbed with a pitchfork. Which is not completely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. So, saddle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, because tonight we're going to wander through the not-so-glamorous centuries that made up early medieval Europe. And we'll do it in the usual calm, sleepy fashion, without the heroic soundtrack, without knights galloping in, just slow, quiet strolls through history's messy hallway. Rome has left the chat. So, first things first, what actually made it dark? Well, Rome collapsed. Or to be more precise, Rome didn't exactly explode into pieces overnight, it more fizzled. Like when you blow out a candle, but the wick keeps smoldering for a while. That was Rome in the 400s. The Western Roman Empire finally gave up in 476 when a guy named Romulus Augustulus, who sounded like he should have been majestic, but was more of a teenager plopped on a throne, got kicked out by some barbarian general. And yes, that was the actual last Roman emperor's name, Romulus, like the founder of Rome, and Augustulus, which literally means Little Augustus. So basically, baby emperor. A bit embarrassing. Anyway, once the empire stopped pretending to hold things together, all the infrastructure that Rome had provided, roads, trade, taxes, soldiers, sort of melted away. And suddenly Europe was like, cool, now what? Daily life. Spoiler, it was rough. If you were alive in, say, the year 600, your life probably wasn't glamorous, unless you were part of the tiny elite who could order people around. For everyone else, life was, let's say, rustic. Most people were farmers, not because they wanted to live a cozy cottagecore lifestyle, but because there weren't a lot of other options. You got up with the sun, you went out to scratch the dirt with a plow if you were lucky enough to own one, and then you hoped your harvest didn't fail, because if it did, you were basically toast. Food was very, very basic. Bread, more bread, sometimes porridge. If you were lucky, maybe some cheese or a bit of salted pork on holidays. Vegetables, yeah, but usually just whatever grew locally. And fruit was a luxury. People didn't really sip on orange juice in the mornings. They didn't even know what an orange was. And yes, everyone drank beer. Even kids. Not the kind of beer you'd brag about at a craft brewery. It was more like weak, watery grain juice, but it was safer than water, which often had, let's call them, mystery floaties. Cleanliness. Let's just say minimal. Now, let's address the stereotype. Were people in the Dark Ages constantly filthy? Sort of. Bathing wasn't high on the list of priorities. That said, medieval folks weren't allergic to soap. They did wash, just not daily, and not with hot showers and eucalyptus-scented body wash. In many villages, you'd get maybe one proper bath a week, if that. Nobles sometimes had fancy tubs, but common folk just splashed around in rivers. Laundry? Done, yes, but sparingly. Clothes were valuable and worn for weeks before being washed. So let's just imagine the smell. Earthy. Very earthy. Teeth? No toothbrushes. People sometimes rubbed with rags and ashes, but cavities were common. And dentistry? Well, let's just say pulling teeth with pliers wasn't a last resort. It was the only resort. Religion. God was everywhere. Something else about the Dark Ages, you couldn't escape religion, specifically Christianity. After Rome fell, the Catholic Church became the one stable institution still standing. It didn't matter if you were a peasant who couldn't read or a king trying to look holy. The church had power over everyone. Priests told you what was sinful. Bishops decided what was allowed. And monks copied the Bible by hand for what felt like an eternity. And yes, they sometimes doodled funny little cats and snails in the margins, because monks also got bored. For peasants, religion was woven into daily life. Every feast, every fast, every superstition had a religious angle. If your crops failed, probably God's punishment. If your child survived past age 5, definitely a miracle. Medicine. Or why you don't want medieval healthcare. And speaking of miracles, let's talk medicine. And I'm using the word medicine very loosely here. Doctors believed in the 4 humors, which basically meant your body was full of 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Feeling sick? That meant one of these liquids was out of balance. The cure? Usually bloodletting. As in, you look pale and weak, so let's drain more blood out of you. Other remedies included ground up herbs, crushed gemstones, or prayers. Sometimes leeches. Always leeches. And if none of that worked, well, maybe it was God's will. Sorry. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Many women died in labor, and many babies didn't survive infancy. It's estimated that maybe half of all children didn't make it to adulthood, which is why families had lots of kids, because statistically, only a few would actually live long enough to help plow the field. Kings and nobles. Dysfunction on a golden throne. Of course, while peasants were digging in the dirt, nobles were busy being dysfunctional in castles, which were not the fairy tale castles you imagine. Early medieval castles were cold, drafty stone lumps with straw floors and very questionable plumbing. Imagine living in a giant refrigerator that also smelled like manure. But the nobles loved them because castles meant power. If you had a castle, you could demand taxes, hire knights, and basically lord it over everyone around you. The kings themselves, well, let's just say they weren't paragons of stability. Many Dark Age monarchs were either constantly fighting their neighbors, stabbing their brothers, or marrying their cousins. Sometimes all 3. Take the Merovingians, for example. They ruled the Franks in what's now France. They had this weird tradition of growing their hair long, as if long hair made them magical. If a king got his hair cut, he lost his legitimacy, which is why a lot of palace coups involved not just dethroning someone, but shaving their head. So yes, hair politics, very important. Education. Spoiler, you didn't get any. If you were a peasant, you couldn't read at all. Writing was something for monks and priests. Even nobles were often illiterate. Charlemagne, who ruled in the 800s and was basically the most powerful king of the era, couldn't read or write properly. He tried to learn, but it didn't really stick. Schools existed, but only for the clergy. Monasteries were the intellectual hubs of the Dark Ages, which explains why most surviving books are either Bibles, sermons, or theological treatises. Fun bedtime reading. Let's glide back to the peasants. So, circling back to the majority of the population, the peasants, life was harsh, but it wasn't constant misery. People still had festivals, they still danced, sang, and played games. Holidays, especially Christmas, Easter, and Midsummer, were big deals. There was drinking, music, and lots of bread, because bread was always the main character. Marriage was usually arranged. Divorce wasn't really a thing, unless you were noble and could bribe the church. Most families lived in one-room huts with their animals, chickens, goats, sometimes a cow, all indoors.
All right, so we floated through the mud and porridge of peasant life. Now let's glide up the social ladder a little bit, into the chilly stone halls of nobility, because honestly, if the peasants had dirt under their nails, the royals had skeletons in their closets, usually many skeletons, sometimes literal. The Merovingians, hair, blood, and bad decisions. Let's start with the Merovingians. These guys ruled the Franks, basically early France, from about the 400s onward. And they had, let's call it, a vibe. They claimed descent from a semi-mythical sea monster. Yes, apparently one of their ancestors was part mercreature. You'd think this would inspire them to build a strong dynasty. Instead, they spent most of their time stabbing each other. One thing they were very serious about was hair. As I mentioned in part 1, Merovingian kings grew their hair long because it symbolized power. If you got a haircut, it wasn't just a bad hair day, it meant you were unfit to rule. Some unlucky princes literally lost the throne by being forcibly shaved bald. And you can imagine the palace intrigue. Brothers turning on brothers, cousins plotting against cousins, queens getting involved in all sorts of schemes. Which brings us to one of my personal favorites, Queen Brunhilde, the original "Don't mess with me." So meet Brunhilde. She was a Visigoth princess, married off to a Merovingian king named Sigebert I. Sounds like a medieval IKEA bookshelf, but he was a real person. At first, Brunhilde was the perfect medieval queen, charming, cultured, politically sharp. But then her sister, Galswintha, who had married another Frankish king, was murdered, probably at the suggestion of her husband's mistress, which, understandably, didn't sit well with Brunhilde. This kicked off decades of brutal rivalry. Brunhilde basically spent her life pulling strings, manipulating kings, and waging wars of revenge. Imagine Succession, but with more chainmail and fewer corporate boardrooms. She lived into her 70s, which was remarkable for the time. But her end was not pleasant. She was accused of plotting against the king, again, probably true, and was executed in a way so gruesome, I'm not going to describe it in detail here. Let's just say it involved a horse, some ropes, and not a lot of dignity. So yes, Brunhilde went out badly, but she left a mark on Frankish politics. For decades, she basically ran the show, proving that medieval queens could be every bit as ruthless as kings, sometimes more. Dagobert the not-so-great. Next, let's float to Dagobert I. He was one of the last Merovingian kings to actually have any authority. And, well, he was complicated. He had multiple wives and an endless stream of mistresses, which sure was pretty normal for a medieval king, but he also had a reputation for being impulsive and sometimes cruel. Chroniclers love to remind us of the time he executed his own half-brother by trickery just to secure the throne. Because nothing says family bonding like regicide. He also apparently had a habit of collecting shiny things, especially golden objects. Imagine a medieval magpie with a crown. And after Dagobert, the dynasty slid into decline. Later Merovingians were called the Roi Fainéants, or do-nothing kings, which is exactly what it sounds like. They lounged around while powerful nobles ran everything, a bit like modern CEOs who take long executive retreats while their assistants do the actual work. Enter the Carolingians, the real power players. So, when the Merovingians got too lazy, another family stepped in, the Carolingians. These were the ancestors of Charlemagne. The first big Carolingian boss was Charles Martel. His nickname was the Hammer. Not subtle, but effective. Charles Martel is best remembered for stopping an invasion of Muslim armies at the Battle of Tours in 732. Whether that battle was really as dramatic as later people claimed is up for debate, but the nickname the Hammer stuck, which tells you he was good at branding. His grandson would become Charlemagne, the guy we'll float over to in a minute. But before that, let's just note, medieval dynasties had this constant cycle. One strong leader pulls things together, their kids enjoy the wealth, their grandkids start fighting, and by the time you reach the great-grandkids, everything's a mess again. It's basically the historical version of a family business falling apart. Charlemagne, the almost literate emperor. All right, let's settle in with Charlemagne. He's one of those names you've probably heard, but maybe can't place. He ruled from 768 to 814 and was crowned Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in the year 800, which was a big deal because it basically revived the idea of a Western Roman Empire. Charlemagne was tall, probably over 6 feet, which was enormous back then. He had a booming voice, a fondness for hunting, and apparently he loved roasted meat. Chroniclers made sure to point that out, which is funny because who doesn't? He was married at least 4 times, with about 18 children. So yes, family dinners were crowded. He also had plenty of mistresses because fidelity was not a royal strength. Now, Charlemagne gets remembered as a great educator of Europe. He pushed for learning, set up schools, and encouraged people to read, which is admirable. But the irony is, Charlemagne himself never really learned to write. He tried. He even kept a wax tablet under his pillow to practice letters at night, but his hand just wouldn't cooperate. So he ruled an empire, but couldn't sign his name properly. Relatable. Charlemagne was also deeply religious. He attended Mass every day, even multiple times. He supported the church, sometimes generously, sometimes forcibly. If people didn't want to convert to Christianity, well, Charlemagne made sure they did. Politely put, he wasn't into religious freedom. When he died in 814, his empire was huge. But remember what I said about dynasties? Yup, his sons and grandsons immediately started squabbling. Within a generation, his empire was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Louis the Pious, the overly nice king. So let's glide to Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious. His nickname says it all. He was very religious, too religious. He spent more time praying than ruling, which is not ideal when you're supposed to manage an empire. Louis was the type of ruler who wanted to do everything by the book, which made him not very inspiring. His kids noticed this, and because medieval kids were basically wolves in human form, they rebelled against him constantly. At one point, Louis even did public penance. Picture an emperor kneeling in a church, crying, confessing his sins, while his nobles awkwardly shuffle around wondering who's in charge now. Not exactly a power move. Unsurprisingly, his sons ended up fighting civil wars after his death. Because, of course they did. The Viking problem. While the Carolingians were busy backstabbing each other, another issue sailed in from the north. Vikings. Now, Vikings in popular culture are always shown as tall, muscular, horn-helmeted warriors, which is half true. They didn't actually wear horned helmets, but they did show up uninvited, raid your monasteries, and sail off with your valuables. For the Franks, this was a nightmare. Monasteries were especially tempting because they were rich, poorly defended, and filled with wine, and monks don't fight back very well. So nobles spent a lot of energy building fortresses and bribing Vikings to leave, which of course only encouraged them to come back later. It was basically a protection racket, but with longships. Alfred the Great. One competent ruler, finally. Let's wander across the channel to England, because while the Franks were busy, England had its own chaos. Out of that chaos came Alfred the Great. And yes, they actually called him the Great, which is rare. Usually historians slap nicknames like the Bald or the Fat on kings. Alfred must have done something right. He ruled Wessex in the late 800s and is remembered for holding back Viking invasions. He reorganized his army, built fortresses, and made sure the Danes didn't completely take over. He also pushed for education and translated books into English. So, a practical guy. But like everyone else, Alfred was also plagued by chronic illness. Historians argue about what it was, maybe Crohn's disease, maybe kidney problems, but he spent much of his life in pain, which makes his achievements even more impressive. Imagine fighting off Vikings while dealing with digestive issues. Not fun. A pause for perspective. So, let's zoom out for a second. The Dark Ages weren't actually one endless night of ignorance. Yes, a lot of kings were incompetent. Yes, peasants lived hard lives. But at the same time, new kingdoms were forming. Christianity spread everywhere. Languages evolved, and despite the chaos, people kept building, farming, writing, and just surviving. The drama of the royals makes it sound like everything was a soap opera. But for the majority of people, it was just seasons of planting and harvesting, births and deaths, winters and summers. And with that, we'll gently drift into part 3. Next time, we'll wander through the later medieval world, where royalty got even stranger, inbreeding got bolder, and the church decided to
So, we've trudged with the peasants, we've lounged with the dysfunctional royals. Now let's drift into the other great power of the Dark Ages, the church. Because if kings and nobles were busy stabbing each other, the church was quietly making sure everyone stayed terrified of sin while also collecting hefty donations. Monks, the original overachievers. Let's start with monks. People love to imagine monasteries as peaceful retreats, quiet stone cloisters, soft chanting, beeswax candles. And okay, sometimes that was true, but most of the time, being a monk in the Dark Ages was exhausting. Your day started at about 2 or 3 a.m. Because yes, monks were woken up in the middle of the night for prayers. They'd shuffle into a cold church, chant for an hour, stumble back to bed, only to wake again before sunrise for more prayers. Basically, a medieval night shift schedule, but without coffee. Between services, they worked, farming, gardening, making beer, copying books by hand. And when I say copying books, I mean every single word, with a quill, on parchment, which was made from animal skin, not exactly a Kindle. But here's the funny part. While they were supposed to stay solemn, medieval monks occasionally doodled in the margins, cats chasing mice, knights fighting snails, rabbits holding swords. Centuries of bored monks basically turned Bible manuscripts into early meme pages. Quiet rebellion, but adorable. Now, let's talk about saints. The Dark Ages were absolutely obsessed with saints, and especially with relics, which were basically holy souvenirs. If a church owned, say, the skull of Saint whoever, or a scrap of cloth that touched the Virgin Mary, pilgrims would flock to see it. And by flock, I mean thousands of people would walk for weeks just to kneel in front of a bone in a jeweled box. Of course, this created a booming relic trade, and let's just say not all relics were, well, authentic.
Some churches proudly displayed the true head of John the Baptist. The problem? Several other churches also claimed to have his head, which means either John had a lot of spare skulls or someone was getting scammed. Still, relics worked. Pilgrims brought offerings, churches made money, and towns thrived. It was basically medieval tourism. Instead of Disneyland, you went to stare at a femur. The church versus fun. One thing the church was very, very good at was ruining people's fun. Dancing too wildly? Sinful. Drinking too much? Definitely sinful. Singing bawdy songs in the tavern? Sinful. Playing dice games? You guessed it, sinful. Basically, anything enjoyable was suspicious, which of course meant people did it anyway. Because if you tell humans they can't gamble, drink, or dance, they're going to gamble, drink, and dance. Kings and the church, awkward frenemies. Of course, kings had to deal with the church constantly. On one hand, they needed bishops to bless their rule. On the other hand, bishops were annoyingly independent. Many medieval kings spent their reigns trying to control church appointments. One classic move was stuffing your relatives into bishop positions, not because they were holy, but because it gave you leverage. You'd be amazed how many medieval bishops were 12-year-old nephews of kings. Picture a child in oversized robes pretending to know Latin. Very dignified. The tension came to a head in what historians call the investiture controversy. Basically, who gets to pick bishops, the Pope or the king? Spoiler, the Pope usually won, but not without decades of sulking and the occasional excommunication. Inbreeding and noble family trees. Now, let's drift back to the noble families themselves, because honestly, their marriages were like one long bad soap opera. Medieval nobles were obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, which really just meant they kept marrying their cousins over and over, because heaven forbid you marry a commoner with working teeth and a normal chin. This eventually led to some fascinating genetics. Take the Habsburgs, who would rise later, but whose roots were already forming in the early medieval world. By the time they hit their stride, their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. The infamous Habsburg jaw was the result, a protruding chin that made chewing a challenge. But hey, at least they could brag about their ancestry, right? Of course, inbreeding didn't always go so well. Many royal children died young, were sickly, or struggled with fertility. But did that stop the cycle? Absolutely not, because nothing says dynastic strategy like marrying your niece. Madness on the throne. Every so often, all that inbreeding, combined with medieval stress, created kings who were, let's say, eccentric. Take Charles the Simple. Yes, that was his nickname. And no, it wasn't meant kindly. He ruled France in the early 900s and got the name Simple because he was gullible and not particularly sharp. Not exactly a royal endorsement. Or Charles the Bald. Spoiler, he wasn't even bald. Chroniclers just had fun being mean. Medieval historians were basically early trolls with ink. And then there's Charles the Fat, which I think you get the idea. He was so incompetent he managed to get deposed by his nobles, which wasn't exactly uncommon, but still embarrassing. So yes, if your name was Charles, the odds were high you'd get roasted by history. Women in the Dark Ages, more than baby making. Now, I don't want to leave out the women of the Dark Ages, because while their lives were often restricted, some managed to carve out real power. Queens like Brunhilde, remember her? Or Theodora of Byzantium wielded serious influence. And abbesses, women who ran convents, could be surprisingly powerful. They managed land, wealth, and even advised kings. Ordinary women, though, lived hard lives. Marriage usually happened young, childbirth was risky, and daily work was endless.
Spinning, weaving, cooking, tending animals, raising children, no rest days, no vacations, and definitely no spa weekends. Still, women held communities together. If men went off to war or just got drunk in the tavern, women kept the farms running. The Dark Ages may have been male-dominated politically, but socially, women were the backbone. Medicine, round 2, astrology edition. Let's drift back to medicine because I can't resist. By the later Dark Ages, doctors had started mixing in astrology with their humors, which meant your treatment didn't just depend on your symptoms, it depended on what the stars were doing. Feeling sick on a Tuesday? Sorry, Mars is in retrograde, so we'll need to bleed you from your left arm instead of your right. And surgeries? Oh yes, they existed, without anesthesia, which meant the best painkiller was usually alcohol and a strong grip on a wooden stick. Broken bone? Set it crudely and hope it heals. An abscess? Lance it and pray. Toothache? Yank it out. It's amazing anyone survived past 40. The plague that wasn't yet the Black Death. Now, quick note, the famous Black Death, the bubonic plague, didn't hit until the 14th century, but that doesn't mean the Dark Ages were plague-free. Smaller outbreaks happened all the time. The Justinian plague in the 6th century, for example, wiped out millions across Europe and Byzantium. For people at the time, plague was both terrifying and mysterious. Doctors had no clue what caused it. Some said bad air, some said punishment from God, some blamed foreigners, which unfortunately became a long tradition. What people didn't realize was that rats and fleas were the real culprits. Instead, they just prayed harder. Spoiler, it didn't work. Daily entertainment. Not Netflix, but close. So what did people actually do for fun in the Dark Ages? Well, peasants played simple games, dice, stickball, wrestling. Nobles loved hunting. Everyone loved storytelling. Epic poems like Beowulf were passed around orally long before anyone wrote them down. And music existed, though instruments were simple. Lyres, flutes, drums. And taverns, of course, were the real centers of entertainment. A lot of singing, a lot of ale, and probably a lot of people passing out on the floor. For nobles, the ultimate entertainment was tournaments. Jousting, sword fights, mock battles. Half training, half spectacle. If you were a knight, it was your chance to show off. If you were a noblewoman, it was your chance to swoon politely while secretly judging everyone's armor polish. Wrapping this drift. So here we are, monks scribbling memes, kings.
So, we've survived the so-called dark centuries of monks, mud, and kings named Charles who couldn't catch a break. Now we're easing into what historians call the High Middle Ages, which sounds glamorous, but in reality was just the Dark Ages with slightly shinier armor and even more family drama. This was the age of crusades, castles that finally looked like castles, and royal families who could not stop marrying their cousins, no matter how weird the gene pool got. Castles finally get fancy. Let's start with castles. Earlier medieval fortresses were basically giant stone refrigerators, cold, drafty, and about as comfortable as camping in a cave. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, castles started to look more like the fairy tale ones people imagine today. Towers, keeps, moats, drawbridges, the works. Of course, the point wasn't comfort. Castles were for defense, which meant they were deliberately miserable. Windows were tiny, furniture was sparse, and toilets, well, they existed, but they were essentially holes in the wall where you sat and hoped gravity did the rest. Not exactly luxury plumbing. Still, nobles loved them, because if you had a big pointy castle, it meant you were somebody. It was medieval status signaling. Forget Lamborghinis or Rolexes. Just build yourself a stone fortress with a moat, and you were basically set. The First Crusade. a long, awkward pilgrimage with weapons. Now let's drift over to one of the most famous features of the High Middle Ages, the Crusades. The year was 1095. Pope Urban II stood up and basically told everyone, hey, wouldn't it be great if we marched across the world, took Jerusalem, and got some heavenly brownie points while we're at it? And people said, sure, why not? Better than staying here and paying taxes. So thousands of nobles, knights, and peasants packed up and headed east. They called it a holy pilgrimage. In reality, it was a mix of religious zeal, land hunger, and let's see if we can grab some treasure along the way. The First Crusade was chaotic, brutal, and weirdly successful. Against all odds, these mismatched armies actually managed to capture Jerusalem in 1099, and the chroniclers wrote about it in gory detail. Blood in the streets, churches full of corpses. Definitely not bedtime reading, but hey, mission accomplished. The later Crusades. Less success, more embarrassment. After that, Crusades became a trend, but like most sequels, the follow-ups were disappointing. The Second Crusade? Disaster. The Third Crusade? Better known because of Richard the Lionheart, but still not much gained. And by the time we get to the Fourth Crusade, it had gone completely off the rails. Instead of marching to Jerusalem, the Crusaders got distracted and decided to sack Constantinople instead, which, minor detail, was a Christian city. Oops. Imagine announcing a charity fundraiser for sick puppies and then using the money to buy yourself a yacht. That was basically the Fourth Crusade. By the end, the Crusades didn't exactly achieve their lofty goals, but they did open up trade, spread ideas, and bring back exotic luxuries. Spices, silk, sugar, which is why medieval Europeans suddenly decided their bland porridge needed cinnamon. Chivalry, the medieval PR campaign. The crusading era also gave rise to chivalry. You've probably heard the word tossed around with knights and shining armor. In reality, chivalry was less about being polite and more about writing rule books for bored nobles. Knights were supposed to defend the weak, serve God, and honor women. In practice, many knights still looted villages, harassed peasants, and ignored the whole honor women part unless it meant writing flowery poetry. But the idea of chivalry stuck. Troubadours, those traveling singers with lutes, spread stories of gallant knights rescuing maidens, which was great PR. Never mind that the real knight was probably covered in mud, smelled like horse sweat, and owed back taxes. Eleanor of Aquitaine, medieval powerhouse. Speaking of women in power, let's drift over to Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is one of the most remarkable figures of the High Middle Ages. Born in 1222, Eleanor inherited the huge and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine. She married the King of France, Louis VII. Problem? Louis was pious, dull, and not exactly romantic. Their marriage was rocky, and after a disastrous trip on the Second Crusade, Eleanor decided she was done. She got the marriage annulled. Then she married Henry Plantagenet, who became Henry II of England. This made Eleanor queen not of one, but of 2 countries in her lifetime. She had 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. Yes, the bad guy from the Robin Hood stories. Eleanor was sharp, politically savvy, and not afraid to rebel, even against her own husband. At one point, she supported her sons in a revolt against Henry II. She got thrown in prison for a while, but later regained her influence. She lived into her 80s, which is wild for the 12th century. Basically, Eleanor was proof that medieval queens weren't just decorative. They could be power players, and in her case, outlive most of the men around her. Cousin marriage, the never-ending cycle. Now let's float back to one of my favorite medieval running jokes, royal marriage choices. Spoiler, they never stopped marrying cousins. The church technically banned marriages too close in kinship. At one point, the rule was you couldn't marry anyone within 7 degrees of relation, which sounds great until you realize medieval Europe's noble families were so interwoven that practically everyone was related within 7 degrees. So, loopholes abounded. Dispensation here, bribery there. By the time you get to dynasties like the Capets, Plantagenets, and Habsburgs, it's all just one big family reunion that never ended. The results were predictable. Sickly heirs, strange facial features, mental instability. But did anyone pause to think, maybe this isn't working? Of course not, because nothing was more important than keeping the land in the family. Richard the Lionheart, great warrior, terrible king. Since Eleanor's son Richard the Lionheart gets so much love in popular imagination, let's talk about him for a second. Richard was brave, charismatic, brilliant in battle. He spent most of his reign off fighting in the Crusades, leaving England to basically fend for itself, which made him a terrible king for England. He barely spoke English, he taxed his subjects to the bone to pay for wars abroad, and while he gets remembered as a hero, the average English peasant probably just remembered him as the guy who drained their pockets. He also had no legitimate children, which meant his brother, King John, ended up inheriting the throne. And John? Well, let's just say history has not been kind. King John, medieval villain, extraordinary. He reigned from 1199 to 1616, and he was, by consensus, terrible. He fought with his nobles, lost most of England's lands in France, and squeezed every penny out of his subjects with taxes. The barons finally got fed up and forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1515, which he hated. He immediately tried to wiggle out of it, but the Magna Carta lived on as a cornerstone of English law. So, in a way, John's incompetence accidentally helped democracy. Oops! Chroniclers also loved trashing him. They called him cowardly, cruel, greedy. He was basically the perfect villain for the Robin Hood stories. And unlike Richard the Lionheart, John actually spent time in England. Lucky peasants. The rise of universities. Nerds assemble. One genuinely positive development in the High Middle Ages was the rise of universities. By the 12th century, places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford became centers of learning. Of course, the curriculum was limited. Lots of theology, some philosophy, a little medicine and law, no fun electives, but still, it was a step forward. Students were usually young men, often rowdy. In fact, medieval university towns complained constantly about student riots after too much ale. So, yes, even in the 1200s, college kids were out brawling in the streets after too much ale. Some things never change. The everyday grind continues. Meanwhile, for peasants, life was still life. Seasons, harvests, prayers, taxes. Technology improved slowly. Better plows, windmills, watermills, crops expanded, but famine still loomed whenever weather turned bad. And then, of course, the church piled on more obligations. Fast days, tithes, rules about what you could eat and when. Fish on Fridays wasn't just a quirky Catholic tradition. It was law. For many peasants, the only escape from endless labor was joining the clergy or becoming a soldier in a lord's army. Neither option was exactly safe, but at least it meant maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't spend every day staring at muddy fields. A pause to breathe. So here we are in the High Middle Ages, kings crusading, queens plotting, nobles still obsessed with cousin marriage, peasants grinding, and the church looming over everything. The medieval world was beginning to feel more structured, more recognizable. Cities were growing, trade was expanding, and culture was slowly blooming. But don't get too cozy because disaster is on the horizon. As we drift into part 5, we'll move toward the 13th and 14th centuries, when plagues, famines, and even more royal nonsense will shake everything up. Because the Dark Ages may have started fading, but medieval Europe still had plenty of dysfunction left to share. So let's keep floating. So, we've trudged through famine, plague, mad kings, and a pope or three. You'd think Europe would be ready to settle down, take a nap, maybe just chill. But of course not. The 15th century is basically the Middle Ages saying, let's go out with one last round of chaos. This is where we get civil wars dressed up as gardening metaphors, royal families in full dysfunction mode, and a slow shift towards something that definitely doesn't feel very medieval anymore. The 100 Years' War, the messy finale. We left the 100 Years' War dangling back in part 5, so let's wrap it up before the roses start blooming. After Joan of Arc's dramatic rise and fall, the war dragged on for another 2 decades. The French, now with better leadership under Charles VII, gradually pushed the English back. By 1453, the English were basically kicked out of France, except for Calais. The war had drained both kingdoms. France, though battered, emerged stronger and more centralized. England, on the other hand, staggered away with bruised pride, empty coffers, and a king who was about as useful as a soggy cabbage. Which brings us to England's meltdown. Henry VI. Henry VI, crowned as a baby in 1422, was supposed to unite the crowns of England and France. Spoiler, he didn't. He grew up to be timid, deeply pious, and prone to mental breakdowns. Sometimes he just sat in silence for months, unable to speak or recognize people. Not exactly the leadership England needed. His weakness created a power vacuum. Rival nobles began circling, forming factions and sharpening their swords. The stage was set for one of history's most confusing family feuds, the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic soap opera. Here's the basic setup. 2 rival branches of the royal family, both descended from Edward III, decided they each had a better claim to the throne. One side used a red rose, Lancaster, the other a white rose, York, and because medieval nobles loved banners and symbols, we've been stuck calling it the Wars of the Roses ever since. In reality, it was less about roses and more about power, prestige, and good old-fashioned grudges. The conflict was brutal, though. Battles, executions, betrayals. Sometimes family members switched sides faster than you could blink. Imagine a soap opera where everyone has swords and keeps getting killed off. That's basically it. The Lancastrians, led by Henry VI and his formidable queen, Margaret of Anjou, fought against the Yorkist claimants. Margaret was fierce, ambitious, and determined to hold on to her husband's throne even when Henry was wandering around in catatonic silence. The Yorkists struck hard. Edward IV seized the crown in 1461, and for a while, things stabilized. But then Edward died young, leaving his sons as heirs. Cue the infamous story of the Princes in the Tower, where the boys disappeared under the watch of their charming uncle, Richard III. Richard III, villain or misunderstood? Richard III gets a bad rap, mostly thanks to Shakespeare, who painted him as a hunchbacked villain who murdered his nephews to steal the crown. The truth is murkier. Yes, Richard took the throne in 1883. Yes, the princes vanished and were likely dead. But whether Richard ordered it, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that his reign was short and unpopular. In 1485, he faced a challenge from Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a thin claim but a strong army. At the Battle of Bosworth, Richard was killed, famously charging into the thick of the fight, shouting, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" Or so the play says. Henry Tudor became Henry VIII, founding the Tudor dynasty. And just like that, the Wars of the Roses ended, not with roses, but with a brand new ruling family ready to kick off the Renaissance era. France, out of the ashes. Meanwhile, France was busy rebuilding itself after the 100 Years' War. The monarchy became stronger, the nobility weaker, and a sense of French nationalism was starting to form. Charles VII and his successors worked to centralize power, reform the military, and squeeze taxes out of a population that was still traumatized from plague and war. France wasn't exactly peaceful. There were still regional revolts, border disputes, and occasional noble tantrums. But compared to England's dynastic chaos, it looked like a kingdom finally on the rise. Spain. Marriage makes a kingdom. Now, let's slide down into the Iberian Peninsula because big changes were happening there too. Spain, as we think of it today, didn't exist yet. It was a patchwork of kingdoms. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Granada still hanging on as the last Muslim state. But then came a power couple, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their marriage in 1469 basically united 2 of the biggest kingdoms, and together they started shaping Spain into a stronger, more centralized state. They also launched the Spanish Inquisition in 1497, which was not exactly Spain's most cuddly moment. By 1492, they'd conquered Granada, completing the Reconquista, and sent a certain Christopher Columbus off to accidentally discover the New World. But let's not sail too far ahead just yet. The fall of Constantinople, a medieval full stop. Meanwhile, over in the East, one of the most dramatic events of the entire Middle Ages was unfolding. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, had been holding on for centuries, an island of Roman legacy in a sea of changing powers. By the 15th century, though, it was surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. In 1453, the Ottomans, led by Mehmet II, finally captured the city after a massive siege. Cannons blasted through the ancient walls. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, supposedly died fighting on the walls himself. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. It marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, the rise of the Ottomans as a major power, and a symbolic full stop to the Middle Ages. Daily life in the 15th century. Amidst all this royal drama and empire-shattering events, everyday life carried on. Peasants still farmed, though more of them were free tenants now than serfs. Towns were growing bigger, especially with the rise of trade networks like the Hanseatic League. Merchants and bankers, especially in places like Florence, were becoming rich and influential. Clothing was fancier too. Bright colors, fur trim, extravagant hats. If you were wealthy, you could show it off. If you were poor, you just tried not to freeze in winter. And of course, the printing press arrived in the mid-15th century thanks to Johannes Gutenberg. Suddenly, books were cheaper and easier to produce. Ideas spread faster. Knowledge was no longer locked away in dusty monasteries. It was a quiet revolution that would change everything. So here we are, the late 15th century. England has just stumbled into the Tudor dynasty. France is rising stronger. Spain is newly united. The Ottomans hold Constantinople, and a little machine in Germany is about to pour kerosene on the fire of human thought. The Middle Ages are winding down. The Renaissance is about to step in with art, science, voyages, and a whole lot of drama of its own. But before we leap into that bright new dawn, let's linger just a little longer, because Europe may have been inching forward, but it was still dragging the baggage of centuries. Dynasties that couldn't keep their heirs alive, nobles who thought family feuds were hobbies, and peasants who kept trying to survive it all. As we drift into part 7, we'll look at the Renaissance itself slipping out of the medieval chrysalis. Florence, Michelangelo, and a pope or two who maybe took extravagant to dangerous new levels. Let's keep floating along. So, remember how the High Middle Ages were starting to feel like Europe was finally getting its act together? Towns were growing, trade was buzzing, universities were popping up, and knights were polishing their armor for yet another cousin's wedding. Well, surprise, the 14th century decided to flip the table. Because when you think late Middle Ages, 3 words should come to mind: plague, famine, chaos. And also, kings having emotional breakdowns, queens scheming, and peasants finally saying, you know what, we're done with this. The Great Famine, Europe's hangry decade. Before the Black Death stole the spotlight, Europe went through the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317. It started with a few bad harvests. Too much rain, not enough sun, fields turned to mud. Grain rotted, livestock starved. And because medieval Europe loved to rely on 1 or 2 crops, when they failed, everyone was in trouble. Food prices skyrocketed. Peasants couldn't afford bread. Cattle diseases spread, killing herds. People ate whatever they could get their hands on. Acorns, roots, even cats and dogs. Chroniclers even whisper about cannibalism, though that may have been their flair for the dramatic. The famine killed millions, and if you survived, congratulations. You are now weaker, malnourished, and perfectly primed for the real nightmare coming soon. The Black Death, medieval Europe's worst guest. Yes, the plague, bubonic plague specifically, carried by fleas, riding around on rats, stowing away on ships. It arrived in Europe in 1347. Within a few years, it killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Imagine half of everyone you know just gone. The symptoms were brutal. Painful swellings, high fever, vomiting blood. Victims often died within a few days. And medieval medicine? Utterly useless. Doctors wore those creepy bird masks stuffed with herbs. Priests offered prayers, but nothing worked. People panicked. Some turned to extreme piety. Flagellants whipped themselves in public, hoping God would spare them. Others partied, figuring they might as well enjoy life before it ended. It was chaos. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went untended. Labor collapsed. Wages shot up because there weren't enough workers left, which sounds good until the nobles freaked out and tried to clamp down harder. And the trauma lingered. For decades, Europe carried the memory of the Black Death like a scar. Peasant uprisings. Enough is enough. All that social and economic tension eventually boiled over. Peasants weren't exactly thrilled about endless taxes and feudal obligations. And when the plague cut the workforce in half, they realized they had leverage. Cue the revolts. In 1381, England saw the Peasants' Revolt. Tired of high taxes, wage controls, and corruption, peasants marched to London. They actually broke into the city and demanded reforms. For a brief moment, it looked like they might succeed. But then the teenage King Richard II tricked them with promises, their leaders were killed, and the revolt collapsed. Classic bait and switch. Still, the revolt sent a message. The old feudal order was cracking. Serfdom would slowly decline. The peasants weren't just going to bow their heads forever. The 100 Years' War. Because 20 years just wasn't enough. Now, while peasants were revolting and plague was running wild, kings were also busy being terrible at priorities. Take the 100 Years' War. Despite the name, it actually lasted from 1337 to 1453, so more like 116 years on and off. It was basically England versus France in the world's longest family feud. The cause? Land, succession disputes, and national pride. But really, it came down to English kings insisting they had claims to the French throne. Because if there's one thing medieval monarchs loved more than cousin marriage, it was claiming someone else's crown. The war dragged on in fits and starts. Sometimes England won, like at Crécy and Agincourt, where longbowmen shredded French knights. Other times, France rallied, especially with the help of a certain teenage girl. But let's not rush there just yet. The point is, this war drained resources, wrecked lands, and gave peasants yet another reason to sigh and wonder why their rulers couldn't just play chess instead. French royal meltdown. Charles VI. Speaking of France, let's meet one of its most tragically dysfunctional kings, Charles VI. Charles became king as a young man in 1380. Early on, he seemed promising. Then, around 1992, things took a turn. He had his first psychotic episode, suddenly attacking his own knights during a march, convinced they were enemies. From then on, he had recurring bouts of madness. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass and refused to be touched in case he shattered. Sometimes he forgot he was king. Sometimes he just stared blankly, unable to recognize his own wife and children. The court tried to keep the monarchy functioning, but rival factions took advantage. Civil war broke out between different noble houses, making France even weaker during the 100 Years' War. Charles VI lived a long time. Too long, some might say. His reign became a cautionary tale of how fragile royal power was when the king himself was lost in his own mind. Meanwhile in England, Richard II's drama. Across the channel, England had its own royal mess. Richard II, the boy who tricked the peasants in 1381, grew up into an insecure and volatile king. He loved art, pageantry, and ceremony. Great if you're a theater director, not so great if you're trying to hold on to a kingdom full of grumpy nobles. Richard became paranoid, vindictive, and prone to sudden bursts of tyranny. He exiled rivals, seized land, and alienated basically everyone. Eventually, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile, raised an army, and deposed him in 1399. Richard was thrown in prison where he died mysteriously, likely starved to death. So much for pageantry. The rise of Joan of Arc. Now let's float back to France, because this is where the story takes a surprising turn. Enter Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl born around 1412 who claimed to hear voices from God telling her to save France, which honestly was not what the French elite were expecting as their savior. But desperate times, desperate measures. They let Joan lead troops, and she actually inspired real victories, lifting the siege of Orleans in 1429. Suddenly, morale shot up. The French Dauphin was crowned Charles VII, largely thanks to her. Of course, the English weren't thrilled. They captured Joan, put her on trial for heresy, and burned her at the stake in 1431. She was 19. It was brutal, but her legacy stuck. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint, which just goes to show medieval politics could turn a teenage farm girl into both a hero and a martyr, depending on which side of the channel you were on. The papacy's awkward phase. We can't talk about the late Middle Ages without mentioning the church's own meltdown. Remember, the Pope was supposed to be the supreme spiritual leader of Christendom, but in 1309, the papacy moved to Avignon in France. Pope stayed there for nearly 70 years under heavy French influence. Critics called it the Babylonian captivity of the church. Then, when the papacy finally returned to Rome, things got even weirder. At one point, there were two popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, both claiming to be legitimate. Later, for a few years, there were even 3 popes. It was called the Great Schism, and for ordinary Christians, it was a disaster. Who do you obey? Who's the real pope? Meanwhile, the rival popes spent more time excommunicating each other than actually providing spiritual guidance. Eventually, councils sorted it out. But the damage was done. Trust in the church was cracked. Seeds of later reform were quietly being planted. Everyday life in the late Middle Ages. While kings lost their minds and popes multiplied, everyday folk kept trudging along. Towns were livelier now. Bustling markets, guilds, merchant families rising in wealth. The middle class was slowly emerging. But life was still fragile. One bad harvest, one plague wave, one tax hike, and everything could unravel. And looming over all was the sense that the world was unpredictable, unstable, maybe even cursed. No wonder medieval art and literature often obsessed over death. The Danse Macabre, art showing skeletons dancing with the living, was everywhere. A reminder that plague didn't care if you were king or peasant. Everyone ended up in the same grave eventually. So, as the 14th century closes, we're left with a Europe battered by famine, devastated by plague, torn by endless wars, and led by monarchs who were, let's be honest, not at the top of their game. Yet somehow, through all of this, the seeds of change were sprouting. Towns growing, merchants rising.
So, we've trudged through crusades, plagues, and a royal family feud or 10. Now, the 15th century is ending, and people are starting to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the world is shifting. This is the part of history textbooks that always sound a bit too shiny, the Renaissance, as though everyone suddenly woke up one morning, shaved, painted the Mona Lisa before breakfast, and invented science by lunch. In reality, the Middle Ages didn't pack up its bags overnight. It sort of hung around like an overstaying house guest, still eating the bread while Renaissance Italy was trying to invent opera. So tonight, we float into that messy overlap. Florence, where banking meets art. If there's one city that loves to hog the spotlight here, it's Florence. Small, proud, and full of wool merchants who accidentally reinvented banking, Florence became ridiculously rich. And when people are rich, they suddenly decide they need frescoes, cathedrals, and dramatic domes to show it. Enter the Medici family, bankers who became basically the Kardashians of the Renaissance, except with more frescoes and fewer Instagram accounts. Cosimo de' Medici quietly built a fortune, funded artists, and turned Florence into the place to be. His grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was exactly the kind of guy you'd expect with that nickname. Generous to artists, scheming in politics, and perpetually broke despite sitting on a fortune. And because this is Renaissance Italy, there was, of course, a spectacular assassination attempt in the middle of Mass. Lorenzo survived. His brother Giuliano did not. Florence politely called it the Pazzi conspiracy. Everyone else called it what it was: peak Renaissance drama, featuring daggers in church. So, what did all that Medici money buy? Well, suddenly painters weren't just doodling halos on stiff little saints. You get Botticelli painting pale ladies standing in seashells. You get Brunelleschi casually building the giant dome of Florence Cathedral like it was a weekend project. And of course, you get Leonardo da Vinci, who turned into the Renaissance's ultimate multitasker. He painted, he sketched flying machines, he dissected corpses for fun, and then he forgot to finish half his projects. Basically the kid in class who was brilliant but never turned in homework on time. Michelangelo followed soon after, brooding dramatically and carving David out of marble that everyone else thought was unusable. He complained constantly, worked shirtless in the Sistine Chapel, and still managed to redefine what art even was. Popes behaving badly. The Renaissance wasn't just about Florence, though. Over in Rome, the popes had decided that holiness looked best when funded with extravagant palaces and armies of illegitimate children. Take Pope Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia. Yes, those Borgias. He had mistresses, acknowledged his children openly, and handed out church offices like party favors. Subtlety was not his strong suit. Or Pope Julius II, nicknamed the Warrior Pope. Instead of spending his days in quiet prayer, he wore armor, marched into battle, and bossed Michelangelo into painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. When Michelangelo tried to refuse, Julius allegedly threatened to beat him. Nothing says piety like threatening your artist with violence. Spain, gold, God, and Columbus. Meanwhile, Spain was suddenly in the spotlight. Ferdinand and Isabella had wrapped as the Reconquista by taking Granada in 1492, and then they immediately started sponsoring overseas adventures, which is where Christopher Columbus sails in, confidently heading west to reach Asia and instead bumping into the Caribbean. He had no idea he wasn't in India, but that didn't stop him from claiming the land, enslaving people, and writing smug letters home about his discovery. Spain, suddenly flush with gold and silver from across the ocean, was about to become very, very rich, and also very, very arrogant about it. England, the Tudors warm up. Back in England, the Tudors were just settling into their new dynasty after Henry VII grabbed the crown at Bosworth. Henry wasn't flashy, he was careful, thrifty, and spent his reign making sure no one else could challenge him. He married Elizabeth of York, neatly tying up the Red Rose and White Rose rivalry into one neat Tudor rose. It was his son, though, who would drag England out of medieval gloom and into scandalous Renaissance tabloid territory. But let's not sprint ahead to Henry VIII just yet. For now, England is catching its breath, counting its pennies, and waiting for the drama to really begin.
So picture it. The early 1500s. Everyone is feeling pretty good about all this Renaissance flair. Art is booming, trade is booming, and even science is starting to peek its head out of the medieval swamp. But of course, there's one thing nobody's happy with: the church. And honestly, how could they be? The popes are throwing wild parties, selling indulgences like spiritual coupons, and generally acting less like shepherds of souls and more like landlords with very expensive tastes. Enter the Reformation, basically Europe's giant family fight over who gets to be the boss of salvation. Martin Luther and his big mood. It all kicks off in 1517 with Martin Luther, a monk who was perpetually anxious about sin. He wasn't just worried about the odd fib or skipped fast. No, he was the kind of guy who'd confess for 6 hours straight because he was pretty sure he thought one impure thought about cheese last week. But when he saw Johann Tetzel selling indulgences, basically get out of purgatory faster passes, Luther snapped. He wrote up 95 theses and allegedly nailed them to a door of a church in Wittenberg, which sounds dramatic, but really it was the academic equivalent of posting a rant on Twitter. And like Twitter, it went viral. Thanks to the printing press, Luther's theses spread everywhere in weeks. Suddenly, ordinary people were reading his arguments and thinking, maybe the Pope doesn't actually have a hotline to heaven. Rome was not amused. The Pope naturally was unimpressed. The church told Luther to recant. Luther, being stubborn and possibly enjoying the attention, refused. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, yes, that's really what it's called. No, they weren't eating worms. He famously declared he could not go against his conscience. Result? Excommunication, banished, persona non grata. But by then, it was too late. His ideas had already taken root, and Europe was about to splinter into 1,000 angry little pieces. Princes smell opportunity. Now, Luther wasn't alone for long. German princes looked at the Reformation and thought, wait, if we ditch Rome, we get to keep all that juicy church land, and we don't have to send money to Italy anymore. So, like kids suddenly realizing they can raid the cookie jar without asking, a lot of local rulers jumped on board. Protestantism spread across Germany and beyond. Some genuinely cared about the theology. Others just wanted more castles. Both motives worked. Henry VIII, divorce and beheadings, but make it political. Over in England, Henry VIII was watching all this with interest. Not because he cared deeply about indulgences or grace, but because he really wanted to dump his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope, unfortunately, said no. Catherine happened to be the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, and annoying him wasn't on the papal to-do list. Henry, not exactly known for patience, declared himself head of the Church of England. Boom, Reformation, Tudor edition. This move gave him the freedom to annul his marriage, marry Anne, and then, of course, execute her when she didn't produce the desired male heir. Classic Henry. 6 wives later, he left behind a very confused kingdom, a brand new church, and a lot of awkward family portraits. Calvin, Zwingli, and other overachievers. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, other reformers were adding their own flair. Ulrich Zwingli decided communion was symbolic, not literal, which caused Protestants to argue with each other almost immediately. Because why just fight the Catholics when you can fight each other too? Then comes John Calvin, who popularized the idea of predestination. Basically, God has already decided who's going to heaven or hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. Comforting? Not exactly, but people loved the orderliness of it. Calvinism spread like wildfire, especially in Geneva, where everyone suddenly lived like they were being monitored by a very grumpy celestial hall monitor. blood, wars, and too many councils. Naturally, the Catholic Church wasn't going to just sit there while half of Europe stormed off. Enter the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent met for decades, reforming some abuses, reaffirming Catholic dogma, and declaring, basically, Luther was wrong. Full stop. Meanwhile, religious wars broke out across the continent. Germany got the Peasants' War. France had decades of Catholic versus Protestant conflict with massacres like the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572. England saw swings between Catholic and Protestant monarchs depending on who was on the throne. And the Netherlands? They fought Spain for independence while also trying to pick a denomination. It was messy. Very messy. And, of course, through all this doctrinal arguing, peasants still had to wake up and milk the cow. Most people didn't care about the fine points of transubstantiation. They just wanted to know which church door to walk into without getting their house burned down. Life was still hard, but now it came with added side effects of occasional persecution, forced conversions, and constant anxiety about whether your particular brand of Christianity would get you arrested that week. A world expands while Europe implodes. What makes the Reformation especially ironic is that just as Europeans were tearing themselves apart over theology, they were also sailing around the globe. Spain and Portugal carved up South America. The Portuguese dominated trade routes to India. The English and Dutch were poking around the oceans, setting up colonies. So, you've got Europeans insisting that bread is or is not literally Christ's body, while simultaneously enslaving people halfway across the world. Priorities were flexible. A sleepy recap before we drift on. So, by the late 1500s, Europe is thoroughly fractured. Catholic here, Lutheran there, Calvinist over there, Anglicans across the channel, wars have been fought, monarchs have switched religions for convenience, and ordinary people have tried desperately to keep their heads down. The Middle Ages may be over, but chaos is alive and well. And as we drift toward the 17th century, we'll see that all this religious fuss is only warming up. Because if there's one thing early modern Europe loves, it's a good war. Let's float gently onward into part 9, where we'll wander into the age of absolutism, when kings decide that maybe they should stop sharing power altogether, because crowns look better when no one tells you what to do.